So as white settlers continue to move into the West, they are greeted by the more than 325,000 Native Americans that are living west of the Mississippi. And each of these tribes have a unique culture, their unique style of living, and sometimes tribes would fight for land and resources, but as white settlers move in, there continues to be increased strain on those resources, which leads to settlers being attacked. And so the US government decides in 1851 that they're going to meet with Native American leaders from the plains, and they are going to create what becomes known as the Treaty of Fort Laramie. So they meet in Wyoming. And essentially, the US guarantees Native Americans that they will give them annual payments if the Native Americans guarantee the US government that they'll stay in their assigned boundaries and stop attacking these settlers. They also ask that they allow US militaries to build forts. And for a while, this is a successful policy. In the 1860s, however, white settlers continue to arrive in large numbers, and especially as the Transcontinental Railroad continues to push from east to west to be completed in 1869, and it encroaches on Native American lands. Specifically, one of the biggest problems was buffalo, okay, or bison, and these hunting lands that Native Americans had used for centuries, okay, and so they were in conflict with one another. And so to remove the bison, commercial hunters come out and they begin slaughtering bison by the thousands. They would just ride on trains and shoot bison. As you can see, this guy is standing on a pile of bison skulls over here. The Native Americans are devastated by this because they rely on every piece of the bison. They rely on it for food. They rely on it for supplies. They build their homes out of it, their clothing, their tools, everything in their life revolves around the bison and the movement of the bison. And so this friction leads to constant fighting between settlers and Native Americans on the plains. So the US government adopts this policy of reservations, okay, which a reservation is an area of land designated for and managed by a particular Native American tribe. And so it's almost like its own independent country. And they established these in the hope that this would prevent that fighting from happening that was happening between white settlers and Native Americans. However, most Native American tribes found it hard to survive there, and that's because most of the Plains tribes were dependent on this hunting and gathering, where they moved with the seasons, they followed the buffalo, and that isn't a possible way of life on a reservation. Reservations were also supposed to keep Native Americans safe, but we find out that that isn't necessarily true. One of the first incidences is in 1864 in the Colorado Territory, and it becomes known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The governor of the Colorado Territory calls for the Cheyenne to gather near Fort Lyon, which is on the Sand Creek, and it was with the promise that they were going to protect them, okay, from white settlers. And so Chief Black Kettle and his Cheyenne tribe set up camp. They even fly a U.S. flag over their camp to show that they're friendly, they're loyal to the United States. But a militia sweeps into the camp, and this is after the able-bodied men had left to go on a hunting trip, and they slaughter 150 women, children, and elderly that are unarmed. Of course, this is upsetting to Chief Black Kettle, and he aligns with the Lakota and the Arapaho, and they retaliate against settlers in the area as payback for what happened. The reservations also restricted Native American movements, as we had talked before, but they were supposed to provide that safety, and they were mostly supposed to prevent settlers from taking those lands away. So on the plains, one of the largest tribes is the Sioux tribe, and one of the branches of it, the Lakota, are settled on a reservation in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Well, gold is discovered there, and so settlers begin flooding into the territory in search of gold. This man on the right of your screen, General George Custer, allows miners to come in and mine, and it's in the Lakota hunting territory that is supposed to be protected on this reservation. This is a direct violation of the newly revised Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Well, in 1874, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 is actually voided by the U.S. government, and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs demanded that the Lakota leave the Black Hills to open up that area to white settlement. Well, the Lakota chief, whose name is Sitting Bull, refuses to leave. So Sitting Bull eventually moves his band of Lakota Sioux to the valley of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. And he is joined there by Cheyenne tribes and other Lakota and Native American tribes. and they abandon their reservations and they join him to fight against the U.S. military. So on June 25th, 1876, the Battle of the Little Big Horn happens. Custer and his 7th Cavalry had actually been out trying to find Sitting Bull, and Custer had quite a reputation. He was very arrogant. He had done some other questionable things with in regards to Native American tribes. But they come rolling into Sitting Bull's encampment, and they're met by 2,000 Native American warriors. There's only 200 of the U.S. troops, and they're outnumbered. But Custer, being arrogant and being overconfident, attacks anyway. And nearly all of those soldiers, including Custer, are killed by the Native Americans at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And it's the worst military defeat in the Native American Wars, which are just a series of different little skirmishes between Native Americans and the U.S. government over a period of about 5 years. The Lakota, however, after defeating Custer, they don't go on the offensive. They don't go and try to attack the U.S. military. However, the U.S. military does, okay? And they go on the offensive and begin attacking and restricting Native Americans, and this continues for about 5 years. Ultimately, they force Lakota to relinquish their hunting grounds and relocate. The U.S. government seizes the Black Hills, and they open them up to the white settlers. Another tragedy that happens is what they call Wounded Knee. And so the Pine Ridge Reservation is where Sitting Bull and his Lakota tribe had been relocated to. And it's called Wounded Knee because it's located along the Wounded Knee Creek. It's ravaged by poverty, malnutrition, and illness because it's not their way of life. They don't know how to survive in that kind of environment. And so the U.S. government really thought Sitting Bull was quite a problem. He refused to sign treaties. He openly voiced his opposition to the government. Obviously, he led the deadly battle at the Little Bighorn. And at the same time, this ghost dance movement begins. And in 1889, a Northern Paiute, which is another Native American tribe, had a vision of a rescuer destroying white men and restoring the world to the Native Americans. And this really provides a lot of hope to the demoralized Native Americans, and it becomes this ritual every 6 weeks. It begins to spread to other tribes, including the Lakota, and the U.S. government feared that it was going to lead to uprisings and revolts within the Native American tribes. So they really tried to ban it, but it's really unsuccessful, not ineffective, but unsuccessful. Well, in the fall of 1890, troops come into Pine Ridge Reservation to distribute land allotments, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Sitting Bull declared his tribe is going to refuse them. They are not going to agree to live on this reservation on these little plots of land. And this, combined with the belief that he had started the ghost dance movement, which wasn't true, led to a warrant for his arrest by the U.S. government. On December 15th, 1890, authorities try arresting Sitting Bull, and he resists. As he's resisting, a gun goes off, and he is fatally shot and killed. 2 weeks later, the Lakota ghost dancers are confronted by the U.S. Army at Wounded Knee, and they demand that the Lakota hand over their weapons. Somehow shots are fired. No one to this day knows who shot first. But U.S. troops open fire on these Lakota, and about 300 of them are killed, which is the image that you see back here. This is them collecting the victims. And again, this time there are warriors and things there, but it's mostly women, children, and elderly. The massacre at Wounded Knee did not stop the ghost dances, but it did halt further resistance on the plains by Native Americans. So now we're going to turn our attention to the Pacific Northwest, and we are introduced to Chief Joseph, who is a Nez Perce. He's from the Oregonish area. They refuse to give up territory and relocate to Idaho. So Chief Joseph leads his band of about 700 Nez Perce to the Canadian border, and they're hoping to get into Canada away from the U.S. Army. About 30 miles from the border, they're apprehended by the U.S. Army. Well, the U.S. government guarantees land in Idaho, but they break that promise, and they actually get moved to a reservation in Oklahoma, which, if you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest and then been to Oklahoma, you know that those climates, the environment is just completely night and day, right? Arid and dry, wet and warm, lots of fishing opportunities and those kinds of things in the Pacific Northwest, not so much in Oklahoma. And a lot of the tribe ends up dying of disease, and it causes mass casualties for the Nez Perce. He actually has a really famous speech that we heard in the crash course video in class, and the famous line is, "I will fight no more forever." In 1884, there was large public outcry about what had happened to the Nez Perce, and so they are returned to their native lands in Washington state, and they actually remain there today on their reservation. In the Southwest, we are introduced to a man named Geronimo. And Geronimo is an Apache, and he resists government confinement to reservations. They had been confined there in the 1870s, and he frequently left and raided towns and settlements in the nearby area, mostly trying to find food and different things they needed that weren't being provided on the reservation. In September of 1886, he's actually captured along with 400 Apache, and they are exiled to Florida. Many die in Florida. Again, it's almost the reverse of what had happened to the Nez Perce. They were used to this dry, arid climate, and now they're in mosquito swamp land of Florida. And again, there's a lot of deaths. Geronimo petitions the government to return the tribe to Arizona. The government denies the request, but in 1894, they do move them to Fort Sill, Oklahoma instead, where they still do not acclimate well. So we see this word genocide. I think a lot of times when we hear genocide, we think of the Holocaust in World War II, but the definition of genocide is the deliberate killing of a large group of people and its culture. And many see what happened to the Native Americans in the late 1800s as an act of genocide. The wars really ended with Geronimo's capture, and he actually became quite a bit of a celebrity. He published an autobiography in 1906, and he actually dedicated it to President Theodore Roosevelt because he believed in the men he had met from the U.S. government that he was the most fair-minded and would treat the Apache with justice. His final words on his deathbed were, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." And this, again, really has an outcry from the public as they see what is happening to these Native Americans. The public slowly realizes these wrongdoings that are happening, and in 1877, actually, Rutherford B. Hayes spoke out about the broken promises that had been made by the U.S. to the Native Americans. Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book called A Century of Dishonor and submits it to Congress in hopes that it would inspire them to do something about all these injustices that had happened. Okay, one of which we see on the right side here. These are young Native American men at the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. They essentially would go into the reservations and take the children and ship them off to boarding schools in the East, and it was to Americanize them, so strip them of everything that's Native American. So as we look at these Native American young men, if they were still with their tribes, they most likely would have long hair. They would be dressed in a Native American dress, whether that's, hides if you're on the American plains, wearing teal if you're from the American Southeast, those kinds of things. And they also are destroying languages in the process, which is truly sad, and many of those have not recovered. In 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act is passed, okay? And this is what I was talking about. This is why the troops came out to Wounded Knee, because they were going to divide these reservations into these land allotments or sections, and they would be 160 acres of land. And the Native Americans were expected to establish farms. And after 15 years of working the land and living there, they could become U.S. citizens. However, most Plains Native Americans were hunters and gatherers. Few wanted to farm. Okay, and to make it even worse, the government allowed the public to purchase unoccupied allotments, and that ultimately weakened the Native American communities and allowed white settlers to again encroach on their land. White settlers flooded into Western territories as the Native Americans were sent to reservations throughout the 1800s. In the 1890 census, however, no area in the western region had fewer than 2 people per square mile, and the frontier is essentially non-existent anymore. I just thought this was kind of an interesting image that I had found. This is showing Indian land cessions. So if you look back at 1784 to 1819, this is the dark brown is the unceded land. So all that dark color is where Native Americans are living. But as we look at the last claims by the tribe in that top right corner, you can see that those dark brown spaces are no longer there. Okay, so it just shows you how much land was lost in that amount of time.